They say blood is thicker than water, but nobody tells you what happens when your own blood drains you dry and expects you to smile about it. I'm about to share something that exposed a truth I'd been refusing to see my entire life. That the people who are supposed to love you unconditionally can be the same ones who betray you, with the kind of precision that only comes from knowing exactly where to cut deepest. What happened next changed everything I thought I understood about family, loyalty, and who really holds the power when everyone's too busy looking at the spotlight to notice who's controlling the lights. She fired me at her own inauguration party, humiliated me in front of everyone who mattered, and I walked out of that ballroom like I'd lost everything. But here's the secret. Nobody saw coming. I couldn't believe how wrong they all were about what was actually happening in that moment. The truth is, revenge doesn't always look like revenge. And sometimes the person everyone thinks is powerless is the only one who's been paying attention. 3 hours. That's all the time they had left before discovering that being systematically erased your whole life teaches you something far more dangerous than anger. It teaches you patience. Then everything they'd built on my silence came crashing down, and I didn't have to say a single word to watch it happen. I stood there in that glittering ballroom, surrounded by crystal chandeliers and champagne glasses, watching my sister Jenna take the stage like she owned the world. And technically she did. Or at least that's what everyone believed. The investors were clapping, the executives were smiling, and my entire family sat at the front table like royalty at a coronation. I couldn't believe this was actually happening, not after everything I'd done to build this company from absolutely nothing. But there I was, holding my breath, waiting for the shocking moment I knew was coming. Jenna's voice echoed through the microphone with that sickeningly sweet tone she'd perfected over the years. "Before we celebrate tonight's success, there's some housekeeping to address," she said, and I felt my stomach drop. The betrayal was written all over her face before she even said my name. "Melanie has been with us for a while, but effective immediately, her services are no longer needed. Security will escort you out." The room went silent. Not the kind of silence that defends you, but the kind that buries you alive while everyone watches. I scanned the room desperately, looking for just one person who'd stand up for me, just one voice of justice in that sea of expensive suits and fake smiles. My brother David wouldn't even meet my eyes, and my mother just sipped her wine like I was a stranger asking for spare change. The humiliation burned through my chest like acid, but I refused to cry. Refused to give them that satisfaction. Every contract I'd drafted, every late night I'd spent fixing their mistakes, every moment of my self-worth I'd sacrificed for this family. It all meant nothing to them now. The security guard's hand touched my elbow, and I felt the weight of every eye in that room pressing down on me like a physical force. This was karma, wasn't it? Years of being invisible. And now I was the main attraction for all the wrong reasons. I walked toward those double doors with my head up, my heels clicking against marble floors that I'd helped pay for, past investors I'd personally convinced to believe in this vision. They backstabbed me in front of everyone who mattered, turned my life's work into a public execution disguised as a business decision. But here's what Jenna didn't know. What none of them knew as they watched me leave that gala like yesterday's garbage. The truth was buried so deep in paperwork they'd signed without reading years ago, in clauses they'd dismissed as legal jargon, in documents they'd trusted me to handle because I was good with that boring stuff. I'd been reclaiming my dignity for years without them even noticing, building something they couldn't see because they'd never actually looked at me. And as those doors closed behind me, shutting out the music and the laughter and the celebration of my own erasure, I checked my watch. 3 hours. That's all the time they had left to enjoy their stolen victory, to bask in the glory of a company built on my silent labor. I walked to my car in the parking garage, and for the first time in years, I smiled. Not because I was happy, but because vengeance doesn't announce itself with drama or tears. It arrives on schedule, dressed in legal documents and corporate bylaws, carrying the kind of payback that doesn't need an audience to be absolutely devastating. They wanted me gone. erased from the story they were telling about their success. But they'd forgotten that the person who writes the contracts gets to decide how the story really ends. Sitting in my car, I let the memories flood back. Not because I wanted to relive the pain, but because I needed to remember why this moment mattered. I was 7 years old the first time I realized I was invisible in my own family. Jenna had just won some meaningless spelling bee, and my parents threw her a party with a cake and balloons and relatives flying in from 3 states away. Meanwhile, I'd spent that entire week building a working model of the solar system for the science fair, staying up past midnight painting planets and calculating orbits. And when I won first place, my mother said, "That's nice, honey," without even looking up from her phone. The pattern of systematic erasure repeated itself so many times, I eventually stopped counting. Jenna got the college fund. I got a lecture about student loans and building character through hard work. She studied marketing and partying, while I buried myself in business law and contract negotiations because somebody had to actually understand how companies work. When we started the business together years later, well, when I started it and she showed up with ideas, I was the one pulling all-nighters, drafting partnership agreements, securing initial investments through connections I'd built completely on my own. And every single time, she took the credit while I took the paperwork home. I couldn't believe how perfectly they'd trained me to accept scraps and call it family love. "Melanie's so good with details," they'd say, like being competent was some kind of personality flaw that disqualified me from being worthy of recognition. This wasn't romantic infidelity. It was narrative theft, a complete breach of the fundamental promise that family means loyalty, that blood means something beyond convenience. They cheated me out of acknowledgement, lied about contributions, rewrote history so many times that even I sometimes forgot whose idea it was to pursue that first major client. But here's what happens when you're invisible for long enough. You learn to move through the world without leaving fingerprints they can see. Every contract I wrote had layers they never bothered to read, protection clauses they signed while laughing about quarterly projections and expansion plans. I'd learned this from watching my father, who loved us in his own silent way, but understood exactly what kind of family this was. Even he left me his entire legal library and a note that said, "Trust no one, document everything." The family drama taught me that power doesn't come from being loud. It comes from being underestimated so consistently that people forget to watch what you're actually doing. I remember the exact moment I buried the most important clause in our corporate bylaws. It was late one night during our second year in business. Jenna was at some gala schmoozing with investors I'd researched and prepped her to meet. And David was probably drunk at whatever bar he was calling networking that week. The truth was right there in Section 47, subsection C, paragraph 12. Operational control reverts to the original incorporator in cases of fiduciary breach or unauthorized executive restructuring. They'd signed it at a family dinner weeks later, barely glancing at the pages between bites of Mom's pot roast, trusting me because I was just handling the boring legal stuff. Years of this, of being the foundation they built their dreams on while pretending I was just part of the furniture. Every spreadsheet I'd corrected, every investor presentation I'd ghostwritten, every crisis I'd solved at 3 a.m. while they slept peacefully. It all came back to me in that parking garage like a film reel of institutional betrayal. They'd mocked my dedication, treated my competence like it was something embarrassing rather than the only reason we hadn't collapsed in the first 6 months. But invisible people see everything, and I'd been watching, waiting, building something they couldn't destroy because they didn't even know it existed. Earlier that afternoon, 6 hours before the gala, the final confirmation came when I checked the official guest list that Jenna's assistant had accidentally copied me on. There was my name, Melanie Chen, listed under general guests, sandwiched between a caterer's +1 and someone's college roommate. Not under family, not under founding team, not even under executive staff. Just a guest, as if I'd stumbled into this company by accident, as if my last name didn't match the one printed on every corporate document filed with the state. I stared at that email for 20 minutes, feeling something cold and final settle in my chest. Not revenge yet, but its quiet, patient cousin. I scrolled through the program they'd printed for the evening, this glossy 50-page monstrosity celebrating the vision behind our success. Jenna's photo took up an entire spread, David got 4 pages about his innovative marketing strategies, and my mother was quoted extensively about raising children who dream big. My father, who'd been dead for 3 years, got a memorial section. I got mentioned once, in the footnotes, in past tense, as someone who provided administrative support during the early formation period. Administrative support. Like I was a temp they'd hired from an agency, not the person who'd literally written the business plan that got us our first $1 million in funding. The shocking part wasn't that they'd erased me. I'd felt that happening gradually, like watching a photograph fade in sunlight. What caught me off guard was how thorough they'd been about it. How they'd actually rewritten history with the kind of detail that suggested planning and coordination. Someone had gone through every press release, every company bio, every piece of marketing material and surgically removed my contributions. The betrayal was so complete, so calculated, that I almost had to admire the effort they'd put into making me disappear while I was still standing right there. I couldn't believe they thought I wouldn't notice, or maybe, and this cut deeper, they simply didn't care if I did. This was the same pattern I'd lived my entire life, just amplified to a corporate scale with better production value. Growing up, they'd forgotten my birthday 3 years in a row, but never missed Jenna's. In college, they'd attended every one of her theater performances, but couldn't make time for my thesis defense. And now, at what should have been our shared triumph, they'd turned me into a footnote in my own story, exposed the truth I'd been avoiding for decades. I was never actually part of this family in any way that mattered to them. But here's what happens when you're systematically underestimated for 32 years. You develop a very specific skill set. You learn to document everything, to build redundancies, to create insurance policies that look like routine paperwork. Every slight, every dismissal, every moment of moral theft had taught me to trust only what I could prove in writing. And I had proof of everything: emails, drafts with metadata, financial transfers with my digital signature, meeting notes that contradicted their revised history. The truth wasn't just on my side. It was embedded in every legal structure holding this company together. So when I saw my name listed as a random guest at my own company's inauguration that afternoon, something inside me didn't break. It crystallized. This wasn't humiliation anymore. It was liberation from the last shred of hope that they might someday see me clearly. I forwarded that email to my personal account, saved the glossy program as a PDF, and added both to a folder I'd been building for 7 years called Evidence of Systematic Exclusion. Then I opened my calendar, set a timer for 3 hours from the start of the gala, and attached a file labeled Emergency Shareholder Resolution, Pre-Authorized Corporate Action. What they didn't know, what they couldn't know because they'd never actually read what they signed, was that being erased from the narrative didn't mean I'd lost control of the story. 2 hours before I walked into that ballroom, I sat in my home office and initiated a sequence I'd designed 3 years earlier during one of Jenna's strategy meetings, where she'd presented my ideas as her own. My fingers moved across the keyboard with surgical precision, triggering emails to our corporate attorneys, our registered agent, and the 3 board members who weren't family. People who'd always seemed vaguely uncomfortable with how credit got distributed, but never uncomfortable enough to say anything. The subject line was simple: Notice of Emergency Fiduciary Review, Immediate Action Required. I'd written these emails dozens of times in my head, refined them during sleepless nights, and now they were real, flying through cyberspace toward people who had no idea what was about to hit them. The beauty of what I'd built was its complete invisibility until the exact moment it needed to exist. Every clause I'd buried in our corporate documents over the years looked like standard legal protection, the kind of dense, boring paragraphs that make people's eyes glaze over during signing sessions. This is just to protect us if anyone tries a hostile takeover, I'd explained when Jenna had barely glanced at page 47. Standard stuff for companies our size. She'd signed it while texting someone about the gala venue, and David had signed it while arguing with our mother about the seating chart. Not one of them had asked what fiduciary breach actually meant, or under what circumstances operational control might revert to someone else. I couldn't believe how easy they'd made it, how years of dismissing me as not a people person had blinded them to what I actually was. Someone who understood that real power doesn't announce itself. The payback I'd designed wasn't emotional or dramatic. It was mathematical, inevitable, already in motion before they'd even decided to fire me. Every document they'd signed without reading was a loaded gun I'd placed in their hands, and all I had to do was wait for them to pull the trigger on themselves. Karma doesn't need theatrics when you've built it directly into the corporate structure. When justice is just a matter of following the rules they'd agreed to without understanding them. I pulled up the timeline I'd created, cross-referencing it with the gala schedule Jenna had sent out last week. Cocktail hour at 7, my public firing at 7:45, dinner at 8:15. The emergency shareholder meeting would trigger automatically at 10:45, exactly 3 hours after my termination became official in the company records. I'd programmed it that way deliberately, giving them just enough time to feel victorious, to make toasts and accept congratulations, and believe they'd finally cut loose the dead weight that was holding back their brilliant vision. The vengeance was in the timing, in letting them taste success before showing them it was never theirs to begin with. My phone buzzed with a confirmation from our corporate law firm. They'd received the notice and verified that all prerequisites for the emergency meeting were satisfied. The senior partner, Margaret Chen, no relation though we'd joked about it, had called me 3 months ago with concerns about irregularities in executive compensation relative to actual work product. I'd told her to document everything but wait for my signal. That signal was now sent, and I could almost see her in her office, pulling files she'd prepared, reviewing evidence she'd quietly compiled, preparing for a legal action that would be airtight because everything was already approved, pre-validated, and waiting for a single trigger. I checked my appearance in the mirror one last time before heading to the gala. Navy dress, simple jewelry, the kind of outfit that screams, forgettable administrative staff, rather than woman who's about to reclaim everything you stole. Perfect. The truth was about to expose itself in the most public way possible, and I wanted to look exactly like what they thought I was when it happened. Let them remember me as small and powerless and easily dismissed, because that would make what happened next even more shocking when they realized they'd backstabbed the only person who actually knew how everything worked. 3 hours. That's all the time left on their stolen empire, and I was going to enjoy every second of watching the clock count down to the moment their entire world collapsed. Later that night, I was halfway home when my phone started buzzing with notifications I'd been waiting years to receive. The first one came at exactly 10:45, an automated message to all shareholders. Emergency meeting convened. Fiduciary breach protocol activated. I pulled over to the side of the road, hands shaking not from fear, but from the sheer weight of watching something you've built in silence finally come to life. Back at that gala, Jenna was probably mid-speech about quarterly projections when the lawyers walked in with documents that would legally strip her of every title she'd never actually earned. The revenge wasn't in my hands anymore. It was in the corporate bylaws themselves, executing with the cold precision of a machine I'd programmed years ago. The second notification was from Margaret, our corporate attorney. Control transfer initiated. Board vote in progress. All documentation authenticated. I could picture the scene, Jenna's face going pale as she realized what fiduciary breach meant. David frantically trying to understand how a party had turned into a legal proceeding. My mother demanding explanations from lawyers who were simply following protocols she'd signed off on. The shocking part, the part that must have felt like reality breaking, was that none of this required my presence. I didn't need to be there to argue my case or defend myself or prove anything. The truth had been embedded in every contract, every signature, every document they'd treated like meaningless paperwork. Then came the text from James Whitmore, one of the independent board members. Holy shit, Melanie. How long have you been planning this? I smiled at my phone screen because the answer was, since the first time they erased my contributions, since the first investor meeting where Jenna presented my research as her own revelation, since the first time I understood that this pattern of exclusion wasn't an accident, but a system. Every clause I'd written, every protection I'd built, every safeguard I'd hidden in plain sight, it was all leading to this moment when justice wouldn't be something I had to fight for, but something that simply happened because the rules demanded it. The votes came in through the secure portal I'd set up years ago, each one a nail in the coffin of their stolen narrative. 7 votes for immediate transfer of operational control to the original incorporator, me. 0 votes against, because the vote wasn't about debating. It was about executing what had already been legally confirmed. The evidence was irrefutable. Systematic exclusion of a founding member, financial compensation that didn't match actual contributions, public erasure that violated our partnership agreement, and my personal favorite, unauthorized restructuring that triggered the reversion clause they'd signed without reading. I couldn't believe how perfectly it was unfolding, how every piece of evidence I'd quietly collected was now being presented by lawyers who understood that this wasn't personal drama, but corporate law. My phone rang. Jenna's number. I let it go to voicemail, then listened to her voice crack as she demanded to know what I'd done, how I'd done it, screaming about betrayal and family loyalty, like she'd forgotten the last 32 years of my life. The devastation in her voice was almost satisfying, but what really mattered was the legal notification that came through 30 seconds later. Executive restructuring complete. Former CEO Jenna Chen removed from position effective immediately. Former CMO David Chen removed from position effective immediately. Interim CEO Melanie Chen assumes full operational authority pending formal transition. Karma had arrived dressed in corporate letterhead, and it was more devastating than any confrontation could ever be. I started driving again, heading not back to the gala but toward my apartment, because I didn't need to watch them process their defeat in real time. The payback wasn't about seeing their faces or hearing their excuses. It was about reclaiming what had always been mine through the same systems they'd used to erase me. Every email was forwarding to my account now. Every access code was being reset. Every financial control was transferring to someone who'd actually earned it. And the most beautiful part? It was all completely legal, all based on documents they'd signed, all executed through processes they'd approved. They wanted me gone, so I'd simply made sure that when I left, I took everything that was actually mine, which, as it turned out, was the entire company. 3 days after the gala, the formal transition happened in a conference room, not in some dramatic showdown, but through signatures and legal protocols that Jenna and David's attorneys couldn't challenge, because every single document was airtight. I sat at the head of the table, the same table where I'd sat at the far end for 7 years, taking notes while they made decisions, and watched them sign away positions they'd never legally secured in the first place. There was no yelling, no accusations, just the sound of pens on paper and lawyers explaining that dignity isn't something you can steal from someone who's documented everything. The transfer of power was so clean, so procedurally perfect, that there was nothing for them to fight except the reality of their own signatures coming back to haunt them. Jenna tried once to appeal to family loyalty, her voice breaking as she talked about what our father would have wanted, conveniently forgetting that Dad had left me his entire legal library and a note that said, "Trust no one, document everything." I looked at her across that mahogany table and felt nothing. Not anger, not satisfaction, not even the revenge I'd imagined for years. What I felt was the quiet certainty of someone who'd played a long game so perfectly that the victory didn't need dramatics. "This isn't personal," I told her, using the same phrase she'd used when firing me in front of 200 people. "It's just business." The truth was simpler than that, though. It was justice served exactly the way it should be, through systems and structures rather than emotions and scenes. Within a week, the news hit industry publications. Chen Industries undergoes unexpected leadership transition. The articles were carefully worded, legally vetted, but anyone who could read between the lines understood what had happened. Investors I'd personally courted years ago started calling, congratulating me on finally getting proper recognition. Clients who'd always seemed confused about who actually handled their accounts sent messages saying they were relieved to work directly with the person who'd been managing things all along. The public narrative that Jenna had built, the one that had painted me as irrelevant, was crumbling under the weight of people who'd actually been paying attention to who did the real work. My family stopped calling after the second week, once they realized I wasn't going to apologize for refusing to be invisible anymore. My mother sent one email, a masterpiece of passive-aggressive denial, suggesting that I was tearing the family apart over pride. I archived it without responding, because you can't tear apart something that was never whole, can't betray people who'd backstabbed you since childhood. David tried the guilt route, reminding me of family dinners and holidays like those memories should erase years of systematic dismissal. But here's what they never understood. I wasn't destroying the family. I was simply refusing to keep pretending that being related to people means you owe them your self-worth. 6 months later, I sat in the corner office that used to be Jenna's, looking out at the city skyline and reviewing quarterly reports that finally reflected reality. The company was thriving under leadership that actually understood how it worked. Contracts were being honored, employees who'd been quietly competent were getting promoted, and the culture of taking credit for other people's work was being systematically dismantled. I couldn't believe how peaceful it felt to work without constantly watching my back, without wondering which of my ideas would be stolen next, without the exhausting performance of pretending that family drama was normal or acceptable. This was what reclaiming looked like. Not loud, not dramatic, just steady and real, and mine. My phone still had Jenna's number in it, and sometimes late at night I'd see her posting on social media about new beginnings and lessons learned, carefully curated photos that never mentioned what she'd actually lost or why. I never commented, never engaged, because power doesn't shout and victory doesn't need an audience. The story I'd been trapped in for 32 years had ended the moment I stopped accepting their version of reality, and the new story, the true one, was being written in profit margins and employee satisfaction scores and industry recognition that couldn't be stolen because it was based on actual work. They'd wanted me erased, silenced, forgotten like I'd never mattered at all. Instead, they'd given me exactly what I needed: a reason to stop being invisible and a timeline to make sure that when I finally stepped into the light, there was no shadow left for them to hide in. So here's what I need to know. Have you ever been the invisible one in your own family? The person who did all the work while someone else got all the glory? Drop a comment below and tell me your story, because I know I'm not the only one who's lived through this kind of systematic exclusion. What would you have done in my position? Would you have confronted them publicly, or would you have let the system handle it the way I did? And here's the real question that keeps me up at night. Do you think justice served cold is more powerful than revenge served hot? Or does it even matter as long as the truth finally comes out? I want to hear about the moment you realized you were being backstabbed by the people who were supposed to protect you. Tell me about the time you reclaimed your dignity. Or maybe you're still waiting for your moment. Either way, this community is here for those stories that nobody else wants to hear because they're too real, too raw, too shocking for polite conversation. Did someone take credit for your work? Erase you from a narrative you helped build? Make you feel like you were crazy for expecting basic recognition? Share it below. And let's talk about what it really means to stand up for yourself when standing up means walking away from everything you thought you wanted. If this story hit different, if it made you think about your own life and the people who've stolen credit from you, then do me a favor. Subscribe to this channel and smash that notification bell. Because I'm going to keep bringing you these insights that cut through the surface-level advice and get to the complicated, messy truth about family dynamics, power, and what happens when the underestimated finally stop playing small. We're building something here, a space where your experiences matter, and where we don't pretend that toxic is okay just because it's wrapped in the word family. Hit that subscribe button, turn on notifications, and let's continue these conversations that actually change how we see ourselves and the people around us. Your story matters, Now tell me what happened next in your life.